In this video, we're going to dive into the new concurrency system introduced in Swift 5.5 and iOS 15. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's a pretty big system. Like there's no way you're going to learn everything you need to possibly know about this new system in this update section. Like it's so big, it's going to be released over multiple Swift versions over multiple years. Like this could be an entire course in and of itself. Now, I don't want to scare you because in this video, we're going to cover the basics and the context and the initial foundation, right? The fundamentals of it. So when you do go to learn all the future stuff around it, you're coming at it with a solid foundation that will help that learning even more. So what we're going to do here is, again, I'm going to give you the context on what it is, why it's happening, the benefits of it, and then we're going to refactor our network calls in the Appetizer app to the new async await so you have experience with it, you've seen it in action, and I think that will really help, again, your future learning. So on to what this is, why it's happening, etc. So here is a gist from Chris Latner. Highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in this stuff. But you see the Swift Concurrency Manifesto. By the way, if you're not familiar with who Chris Latner is, he's no longer at Apple, but he was at Apple in a big part of the creation of Swift itself. But anyway, this concurrency manifesto, here's the table of contents. I'll scroll real quick. You can see it's ridiculously long, tons of code, samples, all that stuff, all the reasons behind like why they wanted to do this and how. Here's the table of contents that I wanted to show you, right? Part 1, async await. Part 2, actors. Part 3, 4, 5. So with Swift 5.5 and iOS 15, I believe we got parts 1 and 2, and 3, 4, and 5 will come, in future Swift versions. But the foundation is being laid, and again, check out this manifesto if you really want to get nerdy about this stuff, right? It talks about the past and why they did things and where they want to go. Speaking of where they want to go, here's the roadmap. And again, for context, like they've been talking about this for a while. Like you see the date of this is October of 20. So about a year ago, we laid out the roadmap and now it's starting to execute. But if you're curious about the timeline, you can see here, right? You can see the introduction of these new features will span multiple Swift releases. Features will be introduced in broadly 2 phases, right? So Swift 5.5 was the first phase. So the first phase introduces the async syntax, which we're going to talk about. Actor types, which we're going to talk about. The second phase will enforce full actor isolation, eliminate data races, do a bunch more stuff. So the reason I'm pointing this out to you is, again, so you can go check it out. You can see their ideas. You can see, again, the motivation behind this if you want to learn all the history. But again, I wanted to illustrate that it's a huge topic, and we're just going to barely scratch the surface here in this video. And lastly, like I mentioned, WWDC 21. This was all introduced in June of 2021, right? Just a couple months ago, and it just came out of beta like a week ago, as of late September 2021. But you can see here's the WWDC session. I think there's like 5 sessions dedicated to this topic. Here's where I would start, by the way: meet, async, await, and Swift. Oh, I didn't mean to click on it, but that's where I would start. But you can see all these WWDC videos. So yeah, it's a big deal. And like I said, I think this video will give you the foundation, the general knowledge. So when you do watch these videos or do more research, again, you're coming at it from a place of context. Okay, enough rambling about the history. Let's actually dive into some code. So here I am in our network manager. We're going to focus on this call, right? This get appetizers call, which pulls up this list of appetizers that you see here. We're not going to mess with our download image function because iOS 15 and SwiftUI 3, or that's what we're calling it, I guess, also introduced something called async image, which wraps up this downloading images like into an object. Pretty cool stuff. There are some pros and cons to it, which we'll talk about in the next video, but that's why we're not going to mess with this function because that's going to be handled there. So we're really focusing on this get appetizers function. What I'm going to do is copy this whole function. And the only reason I'm doing this, let me comment it out, is so you can see like the before and after, right? You can go back for your learning and compare and contrast like what we had versus what we did. I think it's helpful to leave the old code there so you can see that rather than deleting it. But now that we have our copy, I'm going to start hacking away at this. And throughout the process, I'll talk about like the benefits of this new async await system. And then at the end, I'll go back and do the run through as I usually do. So if you don't quite get it the first time through, you'll get another chance at it. So one of the big errors that happens in this asynchronous code the old way, this old closure way or completion handler way, was you'll notice every time there's an exit from this function, like we get an error or we get an invalid response, we have to manually call completed, right? Completed, failure, invalid URL. If we miss a spot, like let's pretend we didn't have this code here and we just had return. Well, if this happens, the code's just going to return. We're not going to show an error. Nothing's going to happen. It's like a mystery to the user what went wrong. As developers, we have to make sure we handle every single exit, and that's error prone, right? Sometimes people miss one and they forget or whatever, and that leads to errors. So a big part of this new async await is not allowing that. So to do that, we get rid of this whole completion handler paradigm like altogether. But before I delete this code, let's pay attention, right? What does this return? Like the end result of this function returns an array of appetizer. So let's remember that. So we're going to delete our whole completion handler, right? And we're going to return that array of appetizer. Now that's a much simpler function signature, but we're not quite done yet. We have to mark this async to use the new async await system. And that's one part of it, but we also want to throw various errors, right? We still want to handle invalid URL, invalid response, invalid data. And actually on that note, what I'm going to do is we're going to do this first without handling individual errors, because handling these individual errors actually adds a bit of extra complexity that I think might be confusing in the beginning. So we'll do a really stripped down version where we don't care about specific errors. We still want to throw an error if something goes wrong, but it'll be a more general error. Like, you've probably seen them before, right? Something went wrong with your task. Please check your internet connection or try again later, right? Those generic errors. We're going to work with it in that format first because that will focus on async await. Because again, handling individual errors adds a bit of complexity that I don't want to confuse you with. We still want this to be async throws. So the throws means we want to throw an error if something goes wrong. We'll come back to this more when we handle the individual errors, but you'll see this is also kind of a catch-all. Like this won't let us not throw an error by marking it throws. Oh, actually I put these in the wrong spots. That's what this error is right here. It says async may only occur before the arrow. Sometimes, when you're talking and teaching, you mess up little things like that. Yeah, so async throws goes before this. So let's read this function signature, right? Get appetizers. It's an async function. It's going to throw an error, and it returns an array of appetizers. You'll notice this isn't optional. Like we don't return an error. If this function is not able to return this, it's going to throw an error. You'll see. I'm just going to comment this out for now, these specific errors, because again, we're going to come back to these specific errors, but so I don't want to have to retype them. But for now, we're going to keep it simple with just a generic error. So the first big thing here is we have this let task, URL session, data task with URL. And if you remember from the previous way, like it returned data, response, error, and these were all optionals, right? That's why we did if let error equals error, guard let response equals response, guard let data equals data, because we had to find out if we had a value here because they were optional. Well, as you'll notice, we no longer deal with optionals in this new thing. Another nice little perk here. So we don't have to do a task here. What we do is let, and we do a tuple of data, comma, response, and I'll show you how I know this here in a second. Try, await, these are the two keywords you need, and now we do the URL session.shared.data from. Now this is the new one. You can see it's marked async and it throws. That's the key thing. So this data from is what we want. Now delegate, we don't need that. That can go away. Now we do need the URL, and that's not an optional, right? So I know I said we're not going to handle specific errors. Here's a little taste of how you handle specific errors. We'll just do just this one because I need that URL and I don't want to write a bunch of hacky code just to get around it. So basically guardlet URL equals the appetizer URL. Else, we don't want this completed anymore, right? Or the return, because our return is going to be throw. This is the old completion handler way. Now when we want to throw an error, we will say throw, and then we can do AP error, which is our custom error that we created before, dot invalid URL. So that is throwing our custom error. Remember, that's what I said. I didn't want to get into too much, but it'll make it a lot easier. So we need the URL here that we unwrapped right there. And if that URL is invalid, we throw the AP error. Okay, that'll be the last custom error we do initially. So let's talk about this line here, right? This line basically replaces this. And if I click into hold Option and click on it, hit open in developer documentation, you can see here's the data from async throws, and URL session delegate equals nil as the default. That's why I was able to delete it. But look what it returns. It returns a tuple of a data and URL response. Okay, so that's where I got this data response tuple right there. Now, the thing you'll notice, if I go back to that, it wasn't optional. Look, data and response are not optional, which is a huge difference from how it was here, where data, response, and error were optional, right? Now, what's going to happen is if they do return nil, like we don't have a data or response, That's why this throws. This will then throw this overall error that we talked about. So we don't need to handle the specific cases when data, response, or error are nil. We just get data and a response, and we can use that. So that being said, I can delete this URL session data task. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start deleting stuff as we go through. And again, if you're not quite following, I will do a recap to tie it all together. But because we don't even have an error here, we don't have to like unwrap it. Cool, guardlet response equals response. Like, remember, we're gonna handle generic. The only reason we wanted to mess with this response is so we could show a specific failure. Now, big picture, usually you wanna be very specific with your users on what errors to show. I'm sure you've all received that generic error that tells you nothing and is more frustrating than helpful. So definitely wanna do that. That's why we'll come back and I'll show you how to do that. But for now, on this easy one, I'm not even going to mess with, well, I'm going to delete the return and completed because that's the old completion handler way, but I'm going to comment this out for now. We'll revisit it when we want specific errors. And then this whole guardlet data, remember, data is not an optional anymore, so I don't have to unwrap it. That goes away. So now we're into the do, try, catch that where we're working with our data, right? Where we have our decoder, we have our decoded response from the data, right? And this data is not optional, so we have it right here. And then I don't need the completion handler, right? Don't need that. But before I delete it, remember, decoded response.request is our array of appetizers. Just for refresher, if I command click into appetizer response, which I misspelled, Respose. I won't fix it now because that'll derail me. But you see the request is the array of appetizers, just as a refresher. So that's what I want to return, right? Because this function returns an array of appetizers up here. So instead of completed, I will do return decoded response dot request, right? Because it returns an array of appetizers. And then here, instead of completed invalid data, we'll do throw ap error dot invalid data. And then we can delete this task.resume because we don't have it. So now if we go back and look, we're doing the same thing, but it's a lot simpler, right? Because we don't have to handle every possible exit. So, right, we make sure we have our URL, cool, if not, throw invalid URL. And then we get our data and response back here, right? And because this is marked try and await, if it fails, it's just gonna throw an error, right? And we'll handle that accordingly. And then we're not worried about specific responses, so we can go right into decoding our data just like before. And if the decoding fails, we'll throw invalid data. Now, back to these errors, right? What we throw kind of like doesn't matter here. It's how we handle it on the other side that matters. That's why, even though I said we're just doing a generic error, I'm throwing specific ones just to basically get Xcode to shut up. Again, how we handle it at the call site is what really matters when it comes to this, and I'll show you both ways. Okay, and it looks like I have a copy and paste error here with an extra curly brace. That's what happened, too much scope. So I'm gonna highlight this, Control I to really line that up again. And you know what, I am gonna delete this just to really clean that up. We'll come back to that. So yeah, one quick run through because I felt like I was a little jumbled there. So I'm gonna really tighten this up here, right? So we have our function signature of get appetizers. It's marked async throws and it returns an appetizer. Marking it async lets you know that, hey, you can use the async and you can see the await keyword here. You don't have to mark it throws. Like if you're not gonna throw an error, you don't have to mark it throws, but we do wanna throw an error, so we marked it throws. And then here's where we're unwrapping our URL because we need a solid URL, right, to pass into our URL session here. And if we don't have that, we're gonna throw invalid URL. And then here, this is the new way to do a data task. And the key difference here is it returns a tuple of a data response that aren't optional. We don't have to unwrap any more optionals. That's great. Because if this fails, it's just gonna throw an error. Remember, like I said, it was like the catch-all. We don't have to handle all the individual exits. So cool, now this is all basically the same as what we just did, right? We have our data, use our decoder, we decode it, and then we return the decoder response.request. In fact, what I could do is instead of saying decoder response and decoder response.request is, that's just kind of a little extra line here. I can just return the try and then do .request at the end of that, and that gets rid of that because this is the response and then .request. So just one little extra line of code because again, this is marked try. So if this fails, right, if I can't decode the data, it's gonna throw the API error invalid data. So as you can see, when we're not too concerned about our custom errors, really the only custom error we didn't throw was our response one. This gets a lot simpler. Now let's talk about the call site. So if I go to my appetizer list view, you can see where we're calling it here, on appear. So this is the first order of business, right? On appear, the only thing we're doing in on appear is making a network call. So there's a new thing called .task, which is very similar to on appear, and it's basically meant for specifically this thing where you come to a new screen and you're making a network call. The benefit of .task, well, real quick before I forget, let's put our view model in here and let's delete on appear, is that it'll put you in an async context, which means you can use your async await code. And what happens is if the user navigates away from the screen before our network call completes, it automatically cancels the network call. Again, this was basically tailor-made for making a network call when the view loads, like we're using it for. So now we want to go into our view model to the get appetizers here. So appetizer view model, get appetizers, right? Here's this function. And again, the reason this looks so complex is because we're handling the individual errors. That's what adds that extra layer of complexity. But I'm going to do the same thing. Well, you see we're getting errors because we messed up our function here. I'm going to do the same thing where I copy, comment, and then paste it down here again so you can see the before and after. And I'm going to delete everything, really. Delete this whole network manager. I'll keep is loading equals true because that's going to happen. But now this gets a lot cleaner. So let's scroll up a little bit. I know it might be hard to see, but the whole point of this network manager, right, is to, in the success case, you see we set appetizers or self.appetizers equal to appetizers, right? Which is our published variable appetizers. So when that array updates, it updates the UI, right? Triggers all that. And we're doing all that on the main thread. It's another benefit of async await we'll get to in a second is we don't have to manually put something on the main thread anymore. Another common error that gets abstracted away into the language. Backing up real quick, that's kind of the point of async await is to take a lot of this error-prone code. Like I mentioned, all the exits from the completion handler that we had to handle, and sometimes you miss one. Here we're talking about, routing things to the main queue. Sometimes people forget that. That causes a lot of bugs. A lot of error-prone code is getting abstracted away into the language. It's one of the benefits of doing this. And the code is easier to read and understand. That's the whole point of why this is happening. I probably should have mentioned that in the beginning. Here we are. Anyway, so we want to return an array of appetizers. That's the main goal. So what I do is and it's going to be in a do try catch block because like I said, when this fails, we want to handle the error accordingly. So I'll say appetizers equals try await. And here's where we use our network call. So network manager.shared.get appetizers. Now, what's going to happen here is if we get a great appetizers, everything goes smoothly. Cool, it's going to be set to this and our UI will update. If this fails, however, it's going to go into the catch block. I'll handle that error in a second. And this is where we will show our error. So we'll say alert item equals, we don't have a generic error, right? So if we go to our alerts in the alert thing, right, all this alert context, we don't really have a generic one. We can create one real quick, but this video is already pretty long. So you can imagine just creating another one of these generic errors that says something along the lines of we were unable to complete your request at this time. Please check your internet connection or try again later. Some generic thing is what we would fill out here to show. But again, I want to keep this focused on async await and not get distracted with this little stuff here. So we're just going to say equals alert context dot, we'll say invalid response. Again, this would be where our generic error goes, but that's what we'll put there for now. So now what you're seeing here is async call in a function that does not support concurrency, right? So this is where we need to mark this as a task like we did before. So you do task, put it like that, and put this in here. Now you're in an async context. There's other ways to do this. You can mark this function async, but you got to do other stuff to the function to get that to work. So the simplest way here is to just wrap this in a task to put it in an async context. So I want to make sure I handle this is loading, switching that back to false on both of these cases. So I got to make sure I do that here. Is loading is true. Don't make it false. That way I hide the loading spinner, whether we get a good response or a bad response. Now that's pretty much it when we're not handling specific errors. If I go back up to our main function, you see the bulk of the work was handling our specific errors there. So again, that's what adds that confusing complexity that I wanted to stay away from. But some things you may notice, right? This self, and you may have seen weak self before. You no longer have to handle that in the new async await. That was another common source of errors, was that whole weak self dance. That's out the window. And then the other thing you'll notice here on line 21, I'll actually uncomment it to make it easier to see. We're manually putting this on the main thread. Remember I said you no longer have to do that in async await. So let me comment that back out. And that's because we now have something called actors. So by marking our view model at main actor, basically anything that happens in this view model that's UI related will be rerouted to the main thread. So to put it very simply, marking this at main actor, basically does the same things as dispatch queue.main.async, except it, again, abstracts it into the language and does it for you. And again, for context, I'm giving you super high level foundational stuff because again, going super deep on it would be an entire course in and of itself. But let's make sure this works before I do the recap. So I'm going to run it and we should see the app acting like as we expected, right? Nothing should be different. Yep, here we are. Our image is loaded. App is still working. Accounts there, order there. Cool. Yep, cool. So again, we just refactored the network calls. Okay, so let me do a recap because again, I know that might have been fast. Maybe the first time you heard it might be a little tricky. So back to Network Manager, right? Okay, so the only reason we're getting this error is because we didn't use response. So for now, I can do that to shut it up. Do Command B, should be good. Okay, so now let's run through this again real quick. Again, review, repetition, that's the key to learning. Function signature, it returns an array of appetizers, but we marked it async. So we're in the async context, we can use async await. It throws because we want to throw an error. So because we marked it throws, if I go back to the call site in the view model, that's why we have to use a do, try, catch, because it throws an error. So in the catch is where we catch the thing that's thrown, right? We catch the errors and handle them accordingly. And how we're handling them is setting our alert item to our placeholder for a generic response that will show the alert. Back to the network manager. Okay, so that's the function signature. That's why we mark it throws. And again, the benefit of marking it throws here is that's the catch-all. If anything in here like fails, like we have to handle the error, whereas before we could like forget to handle one of the completion handler exits and we wouldn't handle the error. It'd be confusing. Very common error. So here we're just unwrapping our URL to make sure we have a good one to pass into our data here. Now this is the new in Swift 5.5, this URL session, share.data from URL. Like I said, it returns a tuple of a data and response. These are not optional, right? You're gonna have them because if something fails and you don't have them, because this is marked try, now it's gonna throw an error and then back to our appetizer list view model. Because it threw an error when it tried it, it's gonna go into the catch block and we're handling that with our generic error. Okay, so that's that line. And because we're not like parsing through the individual responses with the status code, like status code 200, 404, 500, like we're not worried about showing individual errors. We don't need to do anything with the response. We only care about the data. So now that we have the data, we can do what we did before, which was have our decoder and then try to decode an appetizer response from that data. And then I want that response.request, which I showed you the request is the array. So I'm returning that array up here. And then if this fails for some reason, like I can't parse out that array of appetizers from that data, we throw AP error invalid data. And then now let's start talking about these custom errors, right? So when I'm throwing this invalid URL, throwing invalid data, this all happens in the catch block. So you'll notice this doesn't throw one of our specific errors. This throws like a typical Swift error. So how we can handle the difference here and handle the individual errors is to go to our call site. And I'm just going to leave the response one. I mean, once you see how I handle these two, you can see how to do the response one and should be able to put that together. We'll do appetizer list view model here. So in our catch block, we have to check for the type of error. So what we can do here, and this is what I was talking about, how this adds some like complexity that doesn't really have much to do with async await, the core principles of it. So I wanted to add this at the end so I wasn't too confusing. So what we can do is just check for the type, right? Our errors that we're throwing, our custom errors, are AP errors. And as a refresher, if I command click into that, remember this is the error we created right here. That's our kind of custom error type. So I want to differentiate between that custom error type and the error that's thrown from here, by Swift automatically. So back to appetizer list view model, right? I can check for that. If let, we'll say AP error equals error. So this error is what gets passed to the catch block. And then I want to cast it, right, as AP error. So essentially what this line is saying is if the error that is in this catch block is of type AP error, okay, cool, let's do some stuff here. And that stuff I'll do is I will basically do similar to what we did up here, right, where we switched off the error and checked the cases, right? So I will switch AP error. And then you see I hit return, another new Xcode 13 benefit. It gave me all the possible cases, right? So essentially I want to do basically this same exact thing right here, right? So just to really play it out, we'll say alert item equals alert context.invalid URL. And I'm just going to copy and paste this so I can speed this up a little bit. And this is .invalid response, invalid data, and then unable to complete. Now you'll notice if I go back to Network Manager, I'm only possibly throwing invalid URL and invalid data, but I want to keep these other cases in case that ever changes in the future, but really invalid data and invalid URL are the only ones that are possibly thrown. But this is how you check for your custom error, right? Is it of type AP error? And if it's not of type AP error, then you would do an else statement on that if let up here, right? If that's not the case, then we want to set our alert item to our generic error. And I know this says invalid response, but remember this is just the generic error placeholder. So you can see why I didn't want to like start with this, because this is just handling specific errors. Doesn't really have much to do with async await. So I didn't want to confuse you with that. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Feel free to ask questions in the comments or on the Slack channel. But that is async await. Again, if you're not handling specific errors, it's really short, simple, nice. And again, the main reason you may think, oh, this isn't much less lines of code. It's not necessarily about being less lines of code, even though sometimes it is. It's more about, like I said, back to the network manager and all these completion handler exits. It's more about abstracting away many of the common errors when writing asynchronous code. Again, handling all the exits, doing the weak self dance, routing things to the main thread. Those are all very common errors. And what async await does is abstracts that away into the language and protects us developers from making those errors.